Good evening and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Brenda Brook and I'm the co-chair of the Book Fair Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Thursday evening to Shifting Worlds, an evening with authors Arkady Martine and PJ Manney. We're celebrating 70 years at the Detroit Jewish Book Fair with one entire year of book and story programming. So join us as we honor the world's first Jewish book fair, highlighting diverse authors, curating new Jewish writing, and promoting the global art of Jewish storytelling. To see our full schedule, watch events you might have missed, and find our online store where you can find our authors' books, A Desolation Called Peace and Conscience, and plenty of other hand-selected books, please visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. And if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both of these at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. I want to express my deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee. Their dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work have made events like tonight's possible. We have a dynamic event for you this evening, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting to the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they'll take as many of your questions as they can. So while you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. And that way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event are the books A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine and Conscience by PJ Manney. We have with us the authors of both books, as well as Jamie Loeb, who will moderate the discussion. A Desolation Called Peace is the spectacular space opera sequel to Arkady Martine's genre-reinventing Hugo Award-winning debut, A Memory Called Empire. In Conscience, PJ Manney concludes her visionary Philip K. Dick Award-nominated series of A World at War, a virtual search for identity and the future of humanity. PJ Manney graduated from Wesleyan University, double majoring in film and American studies. She worked for over 25 years in film and TV, motion picture PR at Walt Disney Touchstone Pictures, story development for independent film production companies, and writing as Patricia Manney for several critically acclaimed TV shows. She also co-founded Uncharted Entertainment, writing and/or creating many pilot scripts for television networks. Manney also consults for varied organizations about the future of humanity and technology, including artificial intelligence, robotics, cyborgs, nanotechnology, biotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, space, blockchains, and cryptocurrencies. She lives in Southern California. Arkady Martine is a speculative fiction writer and, as Dr. Anna Linden Weller, a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner. Under both names, she writes about border politics, narrative and rhetoric, risk communication, and the edges of the world. She is currently employed as a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where she works on climate change mitigation, energy grid modernization, and resiliency planning. Arkady grew up in New York City, and after some time in Turkey, Canada, Sweden, and Baltimore, she now lives in Mexico. Our moderator, Jamie Loeb, was, until a few weeks ago, the Senior Director of Cultural Arts at the JCC of Metro Detroit. She is now a senior consultant at Zuri Group, where she helps nonprofits fulfill their missions with better technology. She remains an avid fan of Book Fair and a dedicated sci-fi fan. So please join me in welcoming PJ Manney, Arkady Martine, and Jamie Loeb.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for that introduction, Brenda. PJ, Arkady, thank you so much for being here. It's so good to see you both. I'm so excited to talk to both of you because I am a huge fan of all of your work. I do want to give a small shout out to Steve Schofer, a member of our committee, who is the one who brought your most recent works to my attention. So I saw him on the comments. I know he's here. Hi, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
We are so glad to have you. So we have sort of two kinds of topics we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to start with some general what's the state of sci-fi sort of topics, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about specific themes that are in both of your works. So we have with us PJ and Arkady, not, say, Nicole, Jennifer, Babs, right? So everyone wants a Babs, right? So these names are not literally the ones on your birth certificates, right? These are names that you chose professionally. And they are names that could read in a lot of different ways in terms of gender. And so I'd like to talk, we're going to start with the elephant in the room, women in sci-fi. Obviously, there's a long history of women writing sci-fi, but they have not necessarily dominated the genre. So I'd like each of you, and maybe we could start with PJ, to talk about some of your foremothers, as it were, the women whose shoulders you stand on, and how you feel being a woman sci-fi writer today. How is that working out for you?
Well, so far so good. I certainly the person for me who was the most important is literally the mother of us all, and that's Mary Shelley. Almost everything I write is based on how does technology affect being human? What does it mean to be human when we have the ability to change ourselves profoundly, to the point of changing ourselves into different substrates of how we think and feel, etc. So I look at the great women science fiction writers as not just inspiration, but also, well, sometimes as a cautionary tale. It was very hard. Many of the most famous, like James Tiptree, wrote under male names just to get recognition. I certainly, my name, those are my actual initials. And I went the J.K. Rowling, please forgive me for saying the name that must not be named. I went the initial route, as many authors do, because the subgenre I write in specifically, which involves techno-thriller as part of its subgenre, is predominantly male. There are, in fact, almost no one I know is a woman who writes it. So it just seemed, why make it harder for myself, since we already know that people work on such subconscious levels, they won't even pick up a book if they think it's written by somebody they can't relate to.
Interesting. Arkady.
So I guess I share an initial with Arkady. My legal first name is Anna Linden. So, but that had nothing to do with why I picked it. I used to be an academic, like professionally. And at the time that I started writing seriously, my primary thought about acquiring a pen name was I wanted to disambiguate between the person that someone who might be one of my students or an academic colleague would find if they Googled my name, not in the sense of hiding that I wrote science fiction. This has always been an open pseudonym. I've always linked the two. But if you're looking for Anna Linden Weller, Byzantinist, you're not really going to want to read the things written by Arkady Martine, science fiction writer, and vice versa. So that was the original idea. And in terms of the gender dynamics of the name, I picked Arkady for silly in-joke reasons. One of my favorite novels, it's actually written by someone else who has a pseudonym that could be gender ambiguous. It's a novel called Spin State, by an author who goes by the name of Chris Moriarty, which is a delightful pen name. And I love this book, and there's a group of characters named Arkady in it because they're all clones. And it was a sort of silly thing to do. Okay, I'm making a copy of myself. I'll name her after a clone. But the gender dynamics that I was thinking of was a kind of ambiguity, like neutrality. In Russia, Arkady is a man's name. In the UK, where I spent some time, Arkady is often a girl's name. So I picked it as a sort of, well, if you want to ask, you can find out. But I mean, I absolutely agree that it is more difficult writing science fiction as a woman or as a gender marginalized person, mostly because of those same reader expectations that PJ was talking about. But I also think that it's really important to acknowledge how rich the history of women writing science fiction is and how deep it is. It's not just the couple of big names. It's my mentors in this field who started publishing a generation before me, so in like the late 90s, early 2000s. They grew up reading the generation before them in the 70s and 80s, which is incredibly rich with female authors. And I mean, my own influences, the biggest influence on these books that I've written is the author CJ Cherry, who is, God, she writes the best politics and the most immersive internality of political minds in the whole genre, in my opinion. And I don't think that has much to do with the fact that she's a woman, but it mattered to me that a woman did it that well when I was starting out.
Well, and I do, it's interesting you say that you don't think people looking for you, the Byzantine scholar, would be interested in your sci-fi books, because I think they absolutely would. Empire.
Well, I mean, you're talking to 25-year-old me who thought that.
For sure.
It turned out that she was deeply wrong in several ways. And quite honestly, if I was starting right now, I probably wouldn't bother with the pen name.
Sure. But it's a good one.
Oh, I really like it. Like, I love it. But it's the thing I was trying to do with it, I don't find necessary anymore. And in my current work, people come to me saying they've read my books a bunch, and then I sometimes talk about sci-fi. I've gotten to do some really neat things with futurism and climate change policy that I wouldn't have been able to do had I not been publicly both people at the same time.
Right. And that's got to be really fun. And so I do want to, reiterate this point that you've both made, is that as much as, sure, it is still harder for women and gender marginalized people to be recognized and, have an easy time of it. I mean, no one has an easy time of it in publishing, but as easy-ish time of it publishing, there is that rich history of women writing sci-fi. It's not a newfangled idea. And I would encourage everyone to scour the internet for those women writers and just, take a crack at it, because, good writers are good writers, and good sci-fi is fun no matter who writes it. So I want to take a little bit of a left turn. And when we were having a really fun discussion preparing for this, we talked about what does Jewish sci-fi mean? Because there are, contrary to what Mel Brooks would have us believe, there are very few Jews in space. There are some, right? There are some there is sci-fi out there that focuses specifically on Jewish characters, Jewish issues, those sorts of things. And there is perhaps more and more of that. But if you look at the bulk of American sci-fi in general, it's rare. And yet, Jews are very much overrepresented in the population that is sci-fi writers, both for literature, TV, movies, all of these things. So, one of the things we talked about is how that overrepresentation has developed a Jewish breed of sci-fi, in that it's a type of sci-fi that's really invested in ethics. And so I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, how that breed of sci-fi, however Jewish it might feel to you, how that has influenced your writing and your sort of reading of sci-fi. And why don't we start with PJ again?
Thanks. Look, I was raised by a sci-fi fan, a Jewish sci-fi fan, who
You and me both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everyone's cool, right?
Who just made me cover not just the length and breadth of Jewish science fiction, but what are considered the classics. And for my father, it was people like Asimov, who had, an entire, in all of his works, whether it was the robot novels, coming up with an ethical framework for how robots could behave in human society, or the Foundation series, where it's literally the ethics of, if we know what's coming, what are the ethics behind what we can do? If we know we can make the hard landing softer, what should we do about it? I found that in any science fiction that interests me is always about ethics. It's always about the nature of these what ifs that we've never had to deal with before. And now we have to bring our ethical frameworks to bear on what we do with it. And my big spiel is technology is morally neutral. It's the ethics we bring to it as citizens. And I emphasize that because we have choices within our societies, and that we have choices that we can bring to bear on how those technologies are used. And really, all of my favorite science fiction is about this. They're the questions I want answered. So, and I'm sure Arkady is similar in that you want to write the things that you want to figure out for yourself too.
Yeah,
you want
absolutely.
to play with and get your hands dirty and
All of my work comes from ethical questions, from not necessarily framed that way, like in my initial impulse to write, but when I think about why I've chosen a particular story or what I've chosen to emphasize in a particular story, it is always about, given this situation, and the wonderful thing about science fiction is that you can push towards relatively extreme situations that don't exist in the present world, and you can sharpen a situation. Given that, what do people do about it? How do they negotiate it? How do they make or break societies and relationships and spirituality? How do they live? How do they determine what are good choices? And I think these are fundamentally Jewish questions. They are for me, in my own experience of being Jewish. And there's a certain space in science fiction to use this concept of the literature of ideas, which is like one of those banners that gets hung from the rafters in science fiction sometimes, to think about literature of ideas in the sense of ideas can be governmental, they can be social, they can be ethical. What happens when you explore those ideas as richly as you would faster than light travel or brain sharing or uploading yourself into a computer? And how do those same technological ideas feed back into the questions of ethics? I also very distinctly remember the first time I hung out with a bunch of not just science fiction fans, because there's like all kinds of science fiction fans, but people who worked in science fiction, people from the New York publishing scene and the Minneapolis and Detroit publishing scene. And at a literary convention, I was like, oh my God, they're all us. They're all my people. My family are musicians. We're classical musicians from New York City. And so it's like there's several ethnic groups that are really part of that scene. One of the big ones is assimilated Ashkenazi American Jews. And it's just like, oh, everybody is here. I know everyone and I know how to be here. And that was very much a relief.
It's really funny you say that too, because absolutely.
And the thing is, some of the people I'm talking about are not Jewish.
No, I understand that. It's
Yeah.
so interesting. It's like they get attracted to it too. But one of the interesting things about Jewish science fiction, and certainly our two works, is we focus a lot on what it is to be the outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is, whether you look at it from an assimilation or not process, or whether you're just so profoundly different because of your brain interfaces. May I just segue for a second and say, I was blown away reading Arkady's work, thinking there is not a single theme she touches on that I don't too. Wait, how do we take this and go into
and they're so different, but it's
so different.
Fun. Like your work is in the genre that I read in some ways the most, but not the one I ever write in.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Same
like
here.
I will eat techno thrillers for breakfast, and like yours are amazing versions of this thing I already adore, and yet I can't write straightforward stuff ever. I'm really bad at it, and like that kind of propulsive action, I don't know how.
When I grow up, I want to actually write space opera. So there you go. But
I do just want to take a moment to remind everyone that you can find both of their most current books, and also the books we're talking about specifically, they are the culmination of series. So I read them backwards, but you can in fact read them from the beginning. Highly recommended. You could go one to the other. It will, it'll definitely keep you in books for a while. But I would also say that the action in both, it can be quite propulsive. It's different breeds of action.
Exactly.
And I think part of why I'm happy to have you both here is that it's the same set of themes and a different set, and it's really interesting to see those similarities and differences. And before we turn to some of those specific themes, I want to talk a little bit more about the differences, and that is in terms of narrative structure. So each of you chose very different types of narratives to use and sort of subgenres, shall we say. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, how those choices get made. Do you have like the content, and then you say, how am I going to lay this out? Is it, I want to try and make a story work in this way, and what kind of story could that be? Arkady, why don't you start this time?
Oh God. Well, so here's the secret. A Memory Called Empire, which is the first book in this series, is the first book I ever wrote, like for real. I mean, I'd written many, many short stories and had them published, and I had made extremely unfortunate attempts at writing novels in my 20s. But I had never written a book. So I wrote, the only way I could convince myself to spend so much time and so many words on one story was to write exactly the kind of self-indulgent bullshit I always wanted to. So
I do want to say for our listeners, it does not read that way. Like I never would have thought to apply those words to that book in a million years. FYI.
I guess what I'm getting at is I didn't pick space opera any more on purpose, except for I love space opera, so I want to write one. Sure. And I am deeply enamored of intrigue plots. Jean Le Carré is one of my favorite authors ever, and I wanted to write one like that. So that was what I did.
In my case, I actually, Revolution was my first book, and it was also the first book I ever wrote. It took a long time for me to write it because I learned how to write prose. Before that, I'd been writing screenplays, and before that, I was told I should never write because I was dyslexic. But after years of telling other screenwriters what to write as an executive, I figured, hold on a second, maybe we should try this. So I actually made a really conscious choice to go after a political techno thriller because one of the things I just, was living in Malibu, California, raising kids, very much kind of, PTA mom. And I was trying to explain to people the things I was interested in. And they were like, oh, no, that's also science fiction. I'm not interested in that stuff. And I thought, aha. You're going to be living it very soon. So let me come up with a subgenre, which already existed, the political techno thriller. And each book actually ups the ante of the science fiction. And until the last book is really hard science fiction. Yeah. But you don't feel it if you start at the beginning and you go through. So it's like I take you by the hand if you don't think you're a lover of science fiction. The number of Malibu moms who came back to me, I thought I would hate science fiction. This is great. And, I felt it was like such a vindication for the genre because one of the problems is this notion that as the genre of ideas, we get it's a literary ghetto, pardon my word usage. And people think that they can't understand it. It's too difficult for them. It's too intellectual. And I wanted to use character and basically beat the crap out of my character for 3 books to get people to understand that you're going to enjoy this as much as you enjoy any kind of reading. And it's not too much for you. And if I take you by the hand and start you with the technology and you watch it expand and grow, you'll get it. You'll get it like we went from horses to cars to airplanes. Like you'll get it. That's the thing you have to think of. You have to think of technology as this really evolving thing that somehow we adapt to. They don't adapt to us. We adapt to it. Yeah. And I can get you to adapt to it in a series of books.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned screenwriting, and I do want to point out that contained in that phrase, many, acclaimed series includes both Xena and Hercules. So off to the IMDb's, all of you.
14-year-old me thanks you for the sexual awakening.
Right, exactly. I get that a lot.
I'm telling you, dear listeners, most of your favorite episodes of both of those shows were written by. There she is.
No, I only wrote a few episodes. I came up with a lot of ideas. About 24 of the shows were pitched by me originally, but then I started making babies, and it was I literally stopped writing when I was breastfeeding, and I had the phone crooked when they had no cell phones then, crooked in my shoulder, and I had the legal pad on my knee, and I just
ergonomically it just wasn't going to work.
It wasn't going to work. Taking story notes. No, this is impossible.
Yep. So where I was actually going with that, though, to mention your great work, but also, I think sci-fi on screen, especially television, is having this mainstream moment. And it's really like Star Trek is everywhere, much to my great joy. But it is so interesting how it is much easier for sci-fi on screen to have this wide appeal, and people still think things like, oh, I'm not a sci-fi fan, I just like Star Trek. Or I don't read sci-fi, I just watch it. And I find that a little baffling, but I think, these sort of sci-fi themes are as as much about the human condition as they are about, science. I guess science is part of the human condition. And where I'm going with all of this is I want to talk about empire and assimilation. And it's one of the themes that you both deal with in very different ways. And, one of Steve in the comments is saying that's one of the reasons he brought Arkady's book to me, because this tension between, being an outsider and having the option to assimilate, and the tension between does that work? Is assimilation actually possible? Does empire just gobble you up? Is there such a thing as a benevolent empire? So I'd like to hear from both of you how you feel about, like, your thoughts on this topic in general, I suppose, but also how and why it was important for you to write about this topic. Arkady, why don't you go first?
Well, it's the central theme of the books,
Yeah.
and that's quite explicit. The thumbnail plot of these two books is a ambassador from a border country, which it happens to be a space station, is summoned to the center of the world to deal with the mistakes or successes of the person who used to have her job. And then there's like a succession crisis and a war. So, it goes well or badly depending on your point of view. But the driving force behind the emotional arc of the books is, what is my protagonist? Her name is Mahit Dasmar. What is she going to do about the fact that she absolutely loves the culture of the empire that is not her culture, and which she also understands to be actively destructive to her culture? And both things are simultaneously true. And this is something that I have been fascinated with probably my whole life. I spent a decade and a bit writing and thinking about assimilation and border edges in the Middle East in the medieval period. That's what my PhD was in. I wrote my dissertation on letters from Byzantine officials who were stationed on the frontier and how they used communication to try to deal with how much they were assimilating and pretending not to. And it's also something that I both think that I have a version of a personal experience of being an American Jew, and that I've seen harsher versions of that experience in some people who are really dear to me, who come from cultures that are recently colonized by Western culture. And in some ways, I wanted to write a book that would honor that experience and what had been shared with me, and that would also be shaped by the questions about belonging, about the edges of the world, about cultural imperialism that had animated my academic career, and also thinking about myself and how I spent like my youth being like, no, I'm a New Yorker, I'm not an American. Because when you're an asshole being young. And then thinking, okay, wait. And then I lived in Europe for a while, and I lived in Canada, and I lived in Turkey. And suddenly it mattered a whole lot to me that I was both Jewish and American, and that was not a safe or simple thing to be, but it was an important one. And that balance between assimilation that is willing and assimilation that is unwilling is one that deeply fascinates me. So, there's the fast version.
In my case, I'm the former American Studies major. So I spent 4 years studying the growth of an American empire. And it was always extremely clear to me in studying world history, the trajectory we were on. It's funny, I lived overseas as well, and in fact became a citizen of New Zealand as well. So I'm a dual national. And the notion of where are you from? Who claims you? Who demands of you? Who has expectations of you became really clear. I mean, from the simplest things like, who do you pay your taxes to? In our case, both.
I know.
And who, my children are all dual citizens. They're born in New Zealand. And I became fascinated by this notion of how we as Jews travel in an eternal diaspora. And we're never, on one hand, we're the eternal outsiders. And my characters, I mean, Ruth Chaikin is the keystone character to the book's Jewishness. She is the literal conscience of the trilogy. And tells the hero all the hard truths and makes him think all the hard ethics that he doesn't want to hear.
Partially in Yiddish.
Yeah, and partially in Yiddish, exactly. Yep. Which just side note, Yiddish was the language in my family that was not taught to me. It was spoken by my parents and grandparents as the language of scandal. So if it was about money, sex, both, or business, it was all spoken in Yiddish. Yeah. So little Patricia couldn't hear. Mm-hmm. And that, I loved learning Yiddish because I started finding phrases that had stuck in my head phonetically. And I would call my mother and say, Mom, Grandma had a potty mouth. And she's like, you're just figuring that out? Because it's such a scatological, earthy language, really. Yeah. I mean, that's the, it's a very scatological language. And my grandmother definitely leaned into that aspect of it. But anyway, I loved the idea that there was a Jewish ethics that was informing a very American story, which is, here's a guy who is in pursuit of the American dream. He's the poor guy, makes good at Stanford, builds the startup. He's everything you think you're supposed to be in America. And he is taken beyond gross advantage of. And he becomes a symbol of what happens when you hand over your power to those you think are more powerful and will be helping you up the ladder of empire. And that really is what it is. And as the years go on, you see the destruction of the American empire, mostly through our hero, because our hero's like, hey, we're going to stop this terrible thing you guys are doing. And it makes it all fall apart. So through the books, we're watching the influence, especially of China, on the manipulation of what remains of a bunch of secessionist states. So I'm actually looking at, whether it's, oh my God, I'm drawing a blank, American Nations. And then there's another book called The 11 Countries of America. But basically how America is a group of cultures. We think we're one thing, but we're not. We're a group of cultures who've all come to accept a certain level of conceptual country. Yeah. But we have different cultures. And as the Jewish outsider, which ironically my hero and his little band become, even though there's only one Jew among them, they have to learn how to negotiate and become many different things. And he literally changes his identity, or has it changed for him, and to adapt and assimilate and trick and manipulate. And I wanted to examine this thing that we do, the code switching we do. Yeah. If we're in a room together, especially a bunch of Ashkenazi Jews, we're in a room, my accent changes. I go back to being the New Yorker I am. Yeah. And, I find that, we just communicate in a different way. And I watched it with my parents, the code switching that went on in their lives to be accepted in New York, not as Jews primarily. And for them, that was important. Yeah. So, is that a disguise? Is that a manipulation? These are all things going through my head of how we go through the world. and have to change ourselves. What is our identity, which is the name of the middle book, really all about?
Yeah, and having just left full-time professional Jewish world to full-time professional mainstream world, I had forgotten about all that code switching. But
moving from Baltimore to Santa Fe, New Mexico was an interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, not that there isn't a big Jewish community here, because there is,
but it's very different.
It's Sephardic,
Yes,
primarily, and it's different. Like, it's really awesome, but it's not the one I know.
Right. So I do want to talk a little bit about identity. I just want to put a plug in for a couple of more books that explore that, like Fractured America. One is American Judas by Mickey Dubrow, who we had at Book Fair a few years ago. Highly recommended. The other, this is a deep cut, the Texas-Israeli War.
Yeah, I've heard about
So for those people who think sci-fi is like this intellectual, cerebral genre, this is very much on the pulp sci-fi end of things, but highly recommended. It's not a war between Texas and Israel, but Texas is sort of its own country, and Israel comes to help it in this complicated multi-America war. Anyways, very fun. So
Also, there is nothing wrong with pulp sci-fi. Like,
no, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
I have this thing, like I'm obsessed with pulps
Nice.
in this way which you wouldn't get from what I've published, but my next book is more in that vein, and I'm just deeply, deeply fascinated by, I think it comes out of my own experience, like being someone who was stuck in airports and buying really bad true crime novels. And like, this is what makes me happy. These are terrible things to read about. Oh my God. And like that kind of mainstream newsstand history of science fiction. There's a very complicated and deep history that actually says a whole lot about the evolution of various bits of the paper industry, and like why we don't see those mass market paperbacks anymore. And distribution, and like you can get into like antitrust and Amazon if you want to go farther. But if you look back at the way in for people when science fiction was just starting to be a thing in America that was popular, even if it was popular amongst a small group, the way in was horror magazines, like scary stories, scary, freaky, uncomfortable stuff.
And comic books sometimes. If you think about Superman, he's an alien. And, I think one of the things I love about that kind of sci-fi is, if you want to know what the 60s were like, right? The beautiful movies of the 60s tell you some part of that equation, but the B movies that couldn't afford set dressing really show you the material reality of that time period, and I feel like pulp sci-fi is kind of the same. It really is sort of a more, dare I say, direct line to what people's fears were and what people's hopes were. And I find that really fascinating, on top of this is just fun to read. So let's talk a bit about identity. That's another theme that both of your works really focus on, and the navigation of identity. And we live in a moment when, of course, identity is top of mind for a lot of people, and it's something we're sort of renegotiating as a culture. So I guess start with perhaps, what does your book have to say about identity, and also how long
everything,
all the things. So I'll narrow that down a little bit to what do you think? Like, what is your favorite thing about identity formation to explore? Like, which part of that very complex, messy process that we all go through is your favorite corner? Let's narrow it to that. How about that? So PJ, why don't you go first this time?
Certainly there are many ways of approaching identity in my book series, but because we were talking about specific technologies which were brain-computer interfaces. I wanted to know what happened to your personality. How could you change your personality without even knowing it by having an interface installed, having other people unknowingly access your interface? What happens when you don't have a body? How does your identity change when you don't have the body-brain connection with hormones and feedback loops of every chemical and physical description? I wanted to examine just how tenuous our sense of identity is. And if, let's say, you were in another body, same brain, same thoughts, another body, you're going to start thinking differently because you're going to have different inputs. I wanted to show the tenuousness, also through the mental illness that occurs in the book, that our very notion of what we think we are is on such thin ice. It is an illusion. And I wanted to have that very personal aspect of how people can change without them even realizing it until something happens that demonstrates it in a large way.
This is one of those areas where I'm like, but we wrote the same thing on completely different axes.
Amazing.
So in my books, there's and I'll preface this because otherwise my neuroscientist friends will hate me. It is impossible, as far as we know, to do the things that happen in my books. This is not how brains work.
But I want them to
as
be
far
possible.
as we know.
I really want them to be possible.
It would be neat. So the MacGuffin, the technological trick in my books is actually a way of enshrining institutional memory. I was thinking about, so if you're on a space station and you don't have that many people because it can't support that many people, and space is dangerous, as we all know, there's all sorts of nasty things out there like explosive decompression and cosmic rays, and those things cause death and cancer, which can cause death. So what if you lost someone who was the only person who knew how to work, say, the hydroponics system? You can't get that depth of knowledge back quickly and easily, no matter how many training manuals you have. But what if you could just download it? And so, but I didn't want to go for like the Matrix-esque, I know Kung Fu kind of downloading a skill. Because institutional knowledge doesn't work that way. Institutional knowledge is partially about relationships. It's a way of understanding how a system breathes, how to interact with it, to interface with it. And that needs a person, because a person learns a system. So in part, I wanted to see what would happen is, okay, so you don't just get the skill set of the guy who had your job last. You get all of the weight of institutional knowledge of the guy who had your job last, which means that you have a kind of version of that guy in your head. And the two of you are really supposed to become one thing, and eventually you do. Because I was very interested in exploring, again, that mind-body interface. What does an endocrine system do? How does that change how people respond? How does memory interact with how people physically react to input, to stimuli, to trauma, and to stretch that generationally, not in the sense of parent to child, but in the sense of mentor to student. Because those relationships are actually some of the ones that are most important in my life, are the relationships I've had with people who taught me, and then relationships I've had with people I've taught. And that kind of generational passing down of knowledge is something that we don't always think of as being as rooted in the body as it is, because all knowledge is. It's all interpretive. So it's reactive to situations, to stimuli. So anyway, I gave my protagonist a ghost, a very talkative ghost who had made some very, very bad mistakes while trying to do some very good things. And then I had fun with it.
It's a great relationship to watch and, well,
Yeah.
to read, I suppose. So we do have one more topic I want to get to, but I want to encourage everyone to put your comments in now and questions, because we do often get 10 million questions in the last minute. So if you're thinking of questions or comments, now's a good time. So you both of your books have brain technology, for lack of a better umbrella term, that sort of by necessity involves a lot of sensitive data and a lot of information going in and out of people's brains. And so I want to talk about another theme that both of you write about, which is who controls information, how, why, where, when. And I mean, to some extent, the issue is, the issue we know and love is cybersecurity, right? And especially in the Jewish world, that's something we're very, very aware of. But I think it's beyond. I think in your books, it's not just about the security of the data, which is a fun plot point sometimes, but it's also about who owns what information.
Yeah.
So, Arkady, you get to start this time.
Okay, so who owns what information is basically the entire first book of the duology. And that was also sort of true in writing it. Because in the first book, I have only one point of view. And that was a very deliberate choice. It also made my life incredibly difficult because she does not have all the information. And some of the information she has doesn't make sense. But I think about A Memory Called Empire as an information control novel. The entire plot is driven by who has access to quote unquote real interpretations of events and who has access to disseminate a version of events, which those are not the same thing. Because I'm also very, very interested in propaganda and mass action. And that's threaded all the way through the book in several different ways.
Hello, Twitter.
Yeah.
Sorry, continue.
And I'm interested in information control because I think it makes fascinating plots, and it also pulls on most of the other threads we've talked about. What you know is often a core component of who you conceptualize yourself to be. And also, what you are willing to keep secret is one of those assimilation tests over and over and over again. I think that's true in a person's everyday life that has no geopolitical significance beyond the basics of all people have some geopolitical significance. But as much as it is true in situations where a person is asked to do things that violate their own sense of ethical self. So who knows what and who is willing to share, I guess. Mm-hmm. And then the second book, the entire resolution of the plot depends on interstellar mail fraud. But that was me to see if I could do it.
That's a great way to describe it. I like that. Interstellar mail fraud.
That was initially so when I write, I often put what goes in this scene in brackets at the top of the scene, so I remember. And that was 8 antidote considers and then commits interstellar mail fraud was the original bracket note. So
that's awesome. So yeah, my books start with the thing the good guys have to stop in the first book is manufacturing consent of an unwilling populace, using technology to do it. And even though the heroes win that's only a battle, not the war. What they end up having to do is stop the rewriting of history. And what happens when you go back to, we all use the internet now for us to remember. What happens when you go back to the internet and the thing you thought happened isn't there anymore? Are you going to say, well, I know it happened. Am I crazy? What's going on? And then you forget. And then the world accepts the new story. And this isn't the victors rewriting history. This is people using mass computing to rewrite history. And I get to play with things like the blockchain and, all different kinds of technologies, which we've been told will make sacrosanct data and transactions. It's not. It doesn't. It's a lie. It's charming. It's lovely. It had a purpose, but it's not actually true. And it's a necessary thing for people to agree exists for entire technologies to be built. So I explain how you do it, but also what happens when we forget as a society, and what kind of people flow into a void of leadership. It's not good people. It's just a hint. And it's not just in my books or in Arkady's books. There's a real issue in our nation's politics that we now believe that how we appear to each other is more important than what we do. And this use of mass propaganda, which really takes off in conscience, and the manipulation of creating the building of the ideal leader, which is ironically a takeoff on the hero himself. And it's a villainous use of the hero, but they're manipulating him and his image and what he stood for. And so I go to town with what people know and what they don't know, and how do you get back what you lost?
Yeah, these are the big questions. And it's interesting, in addition to sci-fi, I've always really loved Russian literature. And especially I reread Crime and Punishment almost every year.
Who doesn't reread Crime and Punishment?
I know
not every year, but every 5.
Right. I love Dostoevsky. I love, is it Kessler who wrote Darkness at Noon? I love that book too. That's another one I reread a few times. And I think it's, it's that theme that is just endlessly interesting of propaganda, of information control, of the way in which you can affect real events with fake information. And I think these are such timely topics, obviously, and not only because of just what's going on in our politics, but also if you think about where the internet was even 20 years ago versus where it is now in terms of the pace of communication and the pace of publishing, really. If you think about all these social media platforms as essentially publishing, if you think about that pace to even 20 years ago, we are not ready for that kind of change. No. And I think, books like yours help us to at least think through the issues, even if we can't solve them like that. And I think it's really rewarding to read these different takes on what are the issues, what are the problems, what can solutions look like, how can we at least begin to have some useful conversations, hopefully without burning the place down. I'm looking at you, PJ.
But having said that,
yes.
that is actually why I write these, because I want people to not experience the future shock. The irony is that's what our problems are coming from right now. Mm-hmm. We are so confused about the nature of who we are and reality, and what's happening next, and who should we trust, and where's the information that'll tell us what's accurate. We're so confused and have such future shock right now that, every major time we've gone through a huge technological transition, we've had terrible future shock and gone through a transition period with a lot of political violence. That's history. Yeah. And Yeah. And what I'm
I
trying to
didn't
do,
want to live through the invention of the Gutenberg Bible, but apparently here we are.
right,
Um,
exactly. And look at all the religious wars that happened from that. And well, but this is what I'm trying to say is that when instead of people being surprised by things, if they have time to start to consider it and go, I don't know, I have to think about that, and start to integrate it into their sense of where they are in time, that creates a much calmer and more measured approach to living your life. And if you also know that this is just a period and we just have to get through it because we've been through these periods before. I even talk about, the cycles of history and clear dynamics and all that stuff in identity. We've been through upheavals before, and it's just who we are as humans. I just want there to be less of a violent effect. I'm trying to make more shallow the drop, shall we say, by sharing these ideas. And I know Arkady, I already know Arkady feels the same way.
In my previous life, when I was an academic, one of the things I cared most about is teaching critical thinking skills, because, what I always wanted my students to leave college with was an ability to prevent wool from being pulled over their eyes, And I think, sci-fi is a genre dedicated to just that, if not in the, slightly pedantic way that one has to literally teach the skill. It is dedicated to asking the hard questions and, learning to think critically, for lack of a better word. So if you're watching, I'm assuming you probably already have some interest in sci-fi, but if you're like Debbie and have never really read sci-fi, I hope we've convinced you. Hi, Debbie, how's it going? And I think, these 5 books, 3 from PJ, 2 from Arkady, are a great place to start. So I want to say thank you to both of you for being here. I want to remind everyone who might be watching this video will stay on our YouTube channel. So send it to your friends who may have missed it, convince them to read all of these books. They're great books. And thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for being with us, those of you at home. I believe Brenda has some announcements. There she is. Thanks, everyone.
Wow. Thank you so much, Arkady, PJ, and Jamie, for being with us and for such a fascinating discussion. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us tonight. And remember, as Jamie said, you can tell your friends to watch this and other events they might have missed by going to our website, culturalarts@jccdet.org/bookfair. Our next event is the Scaffold Effect, Raising Resilient, Self-Reliant, and Secure Kids in the Age of Anxiety, with author Harold Koplowitz in conversation with local parenting expert Frankie Baghdad, this Sunday morning, January 23rd at 11. And remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time. Thank you.